Welcome to Chapter 1, The Financial Matrix Debt Explosion. This chapter aims to lay the groundwork for the massive debt problem in our society and why it's so important for you and I. It begins with the boiling frog analogy, this urban legend about a frog being slowly boiled alive. Of course, if you were to throw a frog into a pot of boiling water, it would obviously jump out immediately. But if you were to place that same frog in lukewarm water and gradually raise that temperature over time, the frog won't recognize the danger right away, and by the time it does, it will have lost the strength to react and eventually boil to death. It's a bit intense, but the analogy is a very powerful one. This vision of the frog, it really hits home with what's happened in America and abroad over the past 50 years or so. But practically speaking, what exactly does that mean for you and I? To answer that question, let's begin by defining what the financial matrix is exactly. The financial matrix is simply a global banking network that creates and loans a sort of monopoly money to lend to people, businesses, and governments for the sake of profit and power. This monopoly money, otherwise known as fiat currency, is money that isn't backed by any tangible asset or commodity. It's important to mention that this practice of creating money out of thin air was something that was illegal until the 1970s. Chapter 1 uses the financial matrix cash flow graphic to explain why this is so important and just how painful this becomes for you and I. You see, the financial matrix banking system sits in the middle of the graphic, printing their monopoly money and loaning it out to businesses, households, and governments. Now, most of us would agree that within the average household, the desire for status and appearance and projecting an image of success has become sort of ingrained in the American psyche over the past 50 years. And because of this, most will tolerate the burden that debt creates and willingly service it to the financial matrix. Moreover, this graphic highlights the growing burden that households endure. As governments often borrow and spend money recklessly, they rely on increasing taxes on both businesses and households to service their debt, which of course you and I feel. As governments often borrow and spend money recklessly, they rely on increasing taxes on both businesses and households to service their debt, which of course you and I feel directly. But there's more bad news. Because governments raise taxes on businesses and very few business owners are willing to absorb that loss, businesses raise prices to cover the added expense, and thus you and I are left to absorb that blow as well. Notice the painful reality this graphic highlights on households. A three-way burden that all of us feel, and the visual evidence of why it's so hard to get ahead financially. You see, since this legalized counterfeiting or fiat currency was permitted in 1971, the total debt has exploded from $2 trillion to over $93 trillion in 2024. This means America was a nation for nearly 200 years of debts of $2 trillion, but in the next 50 years it ballooned to $93 trillion, and the total debt worldwide is on a similar growth curve. The Pew graphic in Chapter 1 is vital to understand. Pay attention to it. It clearly displays that before 1971, people were actually rewarded for their productivity as it increased. However, after 1971, even though productivity continued to increase at about the same rate, workers no longer received the equivalent wage increase due to the inflation caused by this financial matrix system. Thus, the quality of life for the average worker is decreasing even though we live in the wealthiest and most prosperous society in history. The financial matrix is essentially turning those who work for money into wage slaves, and this is all outlined in Chapter 1. It's now time to begin reading.